Writing is about the process. It's about listening and recognizing remnants of your story in the stories of others. When we share our stories with each other, we share the resonance of the human experience. The By Firelight podcast is your invitation to join our circle, a circle of writers, poets, seekers, and storytellers as we capture our living in words. This multifaceted living with joy, grief, love, growth, and loss is shared among us in your legacy, your story. The things you choose to do with your days as they unfold matter here. I'm your host, Betsy Delzer. I'm many things, but in this gathering, I'm a painter, poet, and writer, and I'm honored to be your guide through these episodes. Together, we'll find our muses in the rich and heart-expanding conversations with incredible guests, many who are like minds and all outrageously inspiring hearts. When you press play, you're here, in the circle, to share this space with us. By Firelight.
Paul Gorski is an author, activist, and educator driven by his passions for racial and economic justice. He's the founder of The Art of Reach, a consulting service for authors who have spent most of their careers writing academically or technically, and who want to incorporate more creative elements into their writing or make their writing more accessible and compelling to a broad audience. He's published a wide variety of literature, from award-winning poetry to award-winning professional development books for educators. Paul Gorski, I am thrilled to have you here. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Betsy. I'm happy to be chatting with you.
So as a form of introduction, I would love to just offer this idea or question. If you could kind of time travel and go forward into your older self or backward into your younger self, what would he want to tell us as a way of introducing yourself today, or just as we begin?
Well, I definitely think my older self would just talk about commitment to learning and growing, sort of almost like an addiction to self-growth and challenging myself to broaden my horizons. I feel like it's always been a process of feeling like I kind of have a grasp, some sort of understanding of things, and then getting a swift kick in the hind end, realizing I'm fairly clueless. So I need, adding different angles, looking at things from different angles and trying to understand them better.
Yeah. How long ago can you remember kind of your commitment being conscious to growth and development of self?
I think that kind of came in waves, but I can remember when I was a really young child, just hearing adults say things, mostly things that were racist or sexist or xenophobic. I mean, I didn't have those words at the time, but sort of knowing in my gut that there was something wrong with it and wanting to understand differently. And I think that's what sort of set me on the pursuit of some of the work that I've done. But I definitely think I was in my teenage years, late teens, when I started learning more about systems and how they operate, and just became so curious about dimensions of being that I just felt like I was cheated out of the opportunity to learn about. And so sort of became addicted to finding ways to grow.
It sounds like, so one of the things that we'll sort of tee up here for folks is your longtime commitment to activism and education, both, right? It sounds like you had the seed of that activist starting before language to fit the nature of it. Is that accurate?
Absolutely accurate. And I don't really know how to define it. I just sort of tapped into suffering, my own suffering and other people's suffering in a way that I just couldn't abide it from a really young age. And that often got me into trouble, still does. Get me into trouble.
Yeah. So let's tell our listener a little bit about the frame of your work and your passion. And you can go in any direction you'd like. I mean, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the activist heart, and then it can unfold into actually how that materializes, or any way you want to take us. But I'd love for them to know who we're talking to, because my education friends are tapped in and very excited to be hearing from you today. But for everyone else, I'd love for them to really know who you are.
Absolutely. I'm going back to sort of those teenage years, late teens. I start college. I'm trying to figure out what in the heck I want to do. I thought going into college I was going to be a writer, but I don't know what changed there. I just became interested in some other things. So almost just on a whim started taking some classes about issues like racism and sexism. I remember, for instance, reading the book Why Battered Women Kill in a criminology class, reading the book Savage Inequalities, which is about basically racism and class disparities and educational access, and just feeling really connected to those things. So I knew I wanted to do something. I knew that my path was going to be something related to addressing those kinds of injustices. And then I took a class that was called multicultural education. That's what people used to call what they call educational equity and justice now.
Mm-hmm.
And, we would do a couple weeks talking about racism in schools, a couple weeks talking about sexism in schools and heterosexism and homophobia in schools and on and on. And I just knew that's the path I was going to take. It gave me an outlet. I had some amazing mentors. So that's the path I've kind of always followed. I started when I was maybe 19. And again, I want to be able to say, I wish I could say, I'm embarrassed not to be able to say that I was driven purely by, wanting to do the right thing and that. But it does kind of go back to, and this is kind of the privilege, how this is kind of how my whiteness operates, even in the context of the anti-racism work. The truth is that pursuit was largely about my own development and my own quest to unlearn and learn, and sort of almost like a maybe unintended at the time consequence of that was getting involved in activism. Then once I got involved, I was very committed to it, and it kind of drove my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to think a little bit about this idea that you just mentioned about the only words that are coming to me right now, which I'm not sure are entirely fitting, but it's like the birthplace of your interest in the work. And what I mean by that is you were saying like you were doing this in a way that was sort of driven by your nature to grow or your nature of interest. I am curious about all the work you've done and how you inspire that in others if it is not innately something that they are drawn to or interested in. How do you spark the beginning in someone who might be listening to you or reading your work or taking a workshop where you're having to introduce them to the concept of that growth?
Well, I think in many ways it's not possible in most cases to hook somebody who doesn't want to be hooked when it comes to that sort of thing. I think the best I could do, and what has been successful in certain cases, is sharing my own journey and talking about it. And my approach is not like a finger wagging approach. It's not really a shame and blame approach. It's just very sort of matter of fact, and look at the difference we can make in the lives of children if we're just willing to look at this with a clearer lens and take some responsibility for that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the beauty. I truly believe most people working in schools are people who genuinely care about the well-being of children. There are some people, I've met some educators who I would say that's not true of, and maybe education is not the best career decision. But for the most part, I think they are. So often it's just about opening a different window for people to look through.
Yeah.
And counting on the fact that they want to do better, that we all as educators want to do the best we could do. Even though I know, again, that's not true for everybody, but I start with that assumption. So I'm coming at it as if I'm inviting people into it rather than shoving them into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really like a nuanced approach that is important. My experience in some of this work with educators is that it is mind work, but more so heart work, right? And I think that that's where things can get challenging when we're challenging belief systems, we're challenging history, we're challenging maybe even tradition in various circumstances. I mentioned in the time before we hit record that I've been listening to some of the other podcasts that you've been on, and I was hearing you talk to even just about like homecoming courts and kings and queens and the antiquated nature of that, right? And I was thinking very much of the connections I have to staff members and cultures of schools who are connected to what they've always done, so to speak. So when you are landing in and working a week, 2 weeks, maybe over a course of a school year with a group, how do you bring them into the place just of like examining some of those that they may not even be conscious of?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that's an important acknowledgement too about not being conscious of. But again, I think there are people who have pretty harmful ideologies and they're conscious of those ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
I think what happens a lot in schools and nonprofits and places that, otherwise generally good people can be drawn is that I think there's a couple of things happening. One is because the conversations can be so tough and there's a lot of sort of finger pointing and that sort of thing, that makes people reluctant to engage.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that the thing to remember is that I think where the heart and the mind meet is ideology. And people have ideologies that they don't even realize they have. And one that I've written a lot about and talked a lot about is deficit ideologies. The belief that, just as an example, that students experiencing poverty don't do as well in school because of something that is broken about them or their communities, which of course keeps people from being able to see policies, practices, systems, and structures that are actually creating the disparities. So, I think the key is starting with ideology, which is not a natural place in education because education is such a practice driven thing. People seem to be uneasy talking about ideology. The hunger seems to be, just give me the 5 strategies, just give me the 10 easy steps. And, I think that's the fault of teacher education programs. I think it's partially the fault of a lot of professional development work, but it's really about engaging people around ideology, around their belief systems that feel so natural to people that they don't even really realize them or understand them as belief systems or ideologies. And if I can just sort of not just poke at that a little bit so that people learn how to poke at it themselves internally, but offer different windows to look through.
Mm-hmm.
I often find that if I do that in a way that respects teachers and educators and the challenges that they're up against, then they're willing to look through those windows and try to see things a different way. And so that's basically what I'm trying to do. If you shift the ideology, the practice is going to naturally shift. If you try to shift the practice without shifting the ideology, the practice is going to reshape itself around the existing ideology.
Yes.
So it's got to be about shifting the ideology and then shifting the practice based on that.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, really, if you take exactly what you just said, slow it down and put it through any filter of what we're teaching, that applies, right? Like it's literally like around the practice of teaching science, teaching art, etc. It begins with the ideology. And one way that this is applicable, I mentioned to you as well that I coach teachers at the secondary level in the district that I'm currently working in. I spend more time kind of on the ground, so to speak, thinking about deficit language. And the deficit language is often an indicator of maybe a deficit ideology. But we're looking at like, how do we shift into asset-based language and shift into like looking for the student's genius and how we amplify that versus how are we just managing what's in front of me right now, right? Before I studied education, I actually got my bachelor's in philosophy. And I feel like As much as that felt a little bit privileged and random at the time, but it was really like what I was passionate about, it has served me so well through my career because of exactly what we're talking about. Most of the work that I've ended up kind of devoting my energy, time, and thankfully gainful employment to has been more philosophical. But there are a lot of times when I'm presenting and doing, professional learning and development where I am really having to toggle between and sort of juggle the worlds of, we're going to go into philosophy here and I need to name that for the educators. And then we're going to go into practice, right? And I need to give you something to consider the next time you walk into your learning space. You've been at this for quite some time. Is there one thing that has I'd be so curious, and we could talk shop like this forever, but is there a through line from the beginning of your work with educators 20 plus years ago? I mean, I know you've been in almost every state in the country and then internationally, but what is the through line that is just this recurring theme of your work?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of through lines. One is how important it is to be able to understand how things are kind of operating institutionally and looking at systems, how they're operating in systems. And I know in a way that's a big ask because a lot of individual educators don't feel like they have really a sense of power to change something about the system. When I say system, they're thinking it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
That translates into, oh, you're saying I have to eliminate global poverty or I have to by myself eliminate global racism. But a classroom is a system. Even an individual relationship between a teacher and a family or a student or a parent or caretaker is in a way a system or kind of like a piece of a system. But even understanding parts of that I don't feel any real control over, because the problem is the students who are coming to me, the space that students and I share, they're being deeply impacted by all of that stuff, like lack of access to preventive health care. Now, I have no control over that. I can't afford to pay for everyone to have preventive health care. I can inform my practice in the way that I relate to students based on an understanding that those kinds of systems are impacting how students are relating to me, how students are relating to school, how they're doing in school, and those sorts of things. So I think that's a big piece, a big sort of through line. I think the other big thing is that the problem when it comes to equity concerns in education is not a scarcity of programs or initiatives. Every school, even though it's becoming harder now, every school has programs and something going on. The bigger problem is that most of the programs and initiatives that schools embrace when it comes to equity are things that do not create more equity. So being able to distinguish between the optics and the actual impact, most of what's happening are things that are high on optics but low on impact. Well, look at this cool international food thing we're doing, or a multicultural arts and crafts fair. Those are things that are really high on optics, but have basically no impact overall in terms of people's experiences in schools. And so to get people to think, how can I move toward a more transformative, a more meaningful vision for this thing I'm committed to, so that I don't get sort of sucked into putting my effort into something that's high on optics but low on impact? How do I make sure I'm understanding it and acting in a way that is really has a chance to have the impact that I want to have?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely preaching to the choir here because of my role being in SEL and the constant challenge I have that I enjoy very much, but to not have that be a whitewashed experience, right? To be leaning into Dina Simmons and liberated SEL, transformative SEL, really looking at how are we making this accessible and allowing it to evolve from where it began is like really important. So everything you're saying, I'm just sort of like soaking in like a sponge, but a couple things came up that I just want to think about. And one is, so you really hit on this feeling that I was receiving was kind of this feeling of empowerment when you were talking about the teacher having like even teacher to student, teacher to family is part of the system. And I always call our classrooms ecosystems. In the current climate that, we are in politically and in the education world, some of what I'm sensing as I'm moving building to building, and then I do work in multiple districts as well, is, gosh, the most hopeful word I can come up with is dampening, but I would say almost the most realistic word is an extinguishing of hope in the empowered teacher, right? Like the empowered teacher that they are able to make a difference in maybe this micro system to macro system. What would you say to that person? Just in the case that I have somebody who's listening, who's like, but what can I do? Look at how hopeless it is out there.
Yeah, I mean, especially because the stuff that I'm working on is essentially banned
Yes.
in a lot of contexts right now. So I think there is a loss of hope. One of the reasons why it's so important to connect with other people who have the same commitments. I think people talk about that, but I think so often when people talk about, well, how do I stay kind of resilient and stick with my commitments despite all that's going on? I think often what's recommended is like self-care. It's like we send people off on their own to try to take care of themselves, drink more water, or whatever, do some yoga or meditate or go for a walk. And really, I wish we talked more about community care. Like, how do we take care of one another? How do we not just empathize with one another about these sorts of things, but advocate for one another? Because we're all sort of feeling this. And honestly, in some ways, maybe this is easy for me to talk about because of my identities. The people who are feeling it the most are the people who have always been feeling some version of it, and the worst, getting the worst of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the that essence of community care, how do we take care of one another, how do we kind of organize around the work, but see as part of the work, understand as part of the work, building support systems for one another. I think also a conversation I have with a lot of educators, because as you can imagine, the things I'm talking about, often I'm talking to people who want to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
but are in schools or districts where not only are they not going to be supported, but they could be punished for
Yeah.
doing it. And, and so I'm often talking about, well, the thing we all have to decide for ourselves, and maybe in community with other people who are trying to do these things, is identifying where the line is. And
Mm-hmm.
then, okay, I know that if I cross this line, it is tough because the line keeps moving, but I know if I cross this line, there's a chance I'm going to be run out of this school or run out of this district or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. This is could be true for teachers, could be true for principals, superintendents. So then the question is, how close am I willing to get to that line? I know I can't go in and just willy-nilly do all the things that I want to do. And it's heartbreaking. This is why the community care is so important. It's heartbreaking because the thing that we know as a community of educators is what's happening in schools is not good for kids.
Yeah.
And that is heartbreaking as people who care about kids. And not only is it not good for kids, it's not good for the adults who we love, who are our colleagues. And so it's hard to be like, okay, we have to be strategic and all of that. And maybe some people are in a position where, you know, they can move and find a new job if they need to, but some people have kids. Most people can't do that. So where is the line? How close am I willing to get to the line? And one thing I reflect on in terms of my own identities is the line is probably a little bit further from me because of the way my identities will protect me or
Yeah.
have a better chance of protecting me. The line's probably a little bit further than it is for you, even further than it is for people of color, for men of color, for women of color, for LGBTQ people, whoever it is. So I can probably push it a little farther. And I have to be willing not to judge people who are under more threat than I am, who are making decisions about how far they can. Again, we have to get together as a community, talk strategically, and
Yeah.
and figure out who can lean on what.
Mm. I'm so glad you cast a light on community because as I was thinking through the question and formulating it, that was my leaning was it's the people, right? It's the power of the people that keeps the fires burning. And absolutely around your concept of that there is a lot of self-care. And people who are listening who know me know that I have definitely been involved in yoga movements and bringing things to teachers. But as you were talking, I was like, thank the forces that be as that I'm feeling like grounded in. It's always been a communal experience. I'm not, it's not just come to work an hour late or an hour early and leave an hour early and just go do your yoga siloed. It's like there has always been a desire in me to bring around the collective, and I feel like it's because we needed to, in this era of my work, that was really, really on the forefront. It was like we needed to see each other's humanity outside of these four walls of schoolrooms, classrooms, the boxes of textbooks, et cetera, and curriculum.
Yeah.
My last education question, because I could go on, of course, but this isn't really an education podcast. It's just that I could geek out with you, Paul, all day. But my last question is really more so for thinking around like, so let's just say, you maybe a group of staff have done a book study of yours, or they've engaged with some of your professional learning. I know you have some coming up that I'm really excited about later this fall. I'd be curious if you could just fly on the wall, go see 6 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, 3 years. What would be indicators that the folks who were there are sustaining and building on the work that they learned from you? Like, what would you look and see and be like, wow, they really are thriving based on their learning from some of our experiences together?
Well, I definitely think, sustaining some of the ideological shifts, like being able to catch themselves when they kind of fall into that deficit mindset and sort of push themselves toward a more transformative mindset. I think that's a big thing. I think the thinking transformatively and again, being able to catch themselves when they're thinking mitigatively, when they should be thinking transformatively.
Mm.
That's like the difference between I'm going to swap out one reading in this curriculum to make it more inclusive rather than I'm going to reimagine what this curriculum would look like if it was an inclusive, equitable curriculum. And again, even if I'm in a place where I can't ultimately do that, I won't be supported to do that, thinking first through that lens and then thinking how close to that I can get.
Mm.
So it's that marrying of the ideological shift with the practical application
Mm-hmm.
of it. When I can start seeing that, when I start seeing people catch themselves when they find, I call them like equity detours, when people kind of catch themselves when they're following these little detours, like the deficit ideology detour or the celebrating diversity detour, when I mistake little sort of like celebrations of diversity, like thinking that that's going to do the equity work. You know, th- that's what I see. But the best indication is asking the students how things are different for them. That's to me, the only true way to get a sense of what kind of growth is sustained.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. These are great tips and great conversation. I'm loving this so much. So let's make a segue into your writing world. You mentioned that in college you were thinking about being a writer. So obviously this has been a passion or interest, maybe a gifting of yours for quite some time. When did you start to sort of parallel the work together? Was that something that sort of started from day one?
Not really, because I was a creative writer. I mean, from starting in like elementary school, if I had to characterize myself as something in elementary school, I mean, maybe I was outside playing and playing sports and all that sort of thing. But the thing I was most interested in was writing,
Hmm.
writing poetry and that that sort of thing. So I think I made the connection later. Part of how I made the connection is just meeting other people who have some kind of artistic proclivity and also kind of a social justice lens. Because I just find that the ability to look at things a little differently, not being sort of stuck in conventions, I just really connect with that. I really connect with people who kind of share that. So I think it was later, and then being exposed to people who were doing work, the arts, especially writers, but
Hmm.
others too, where they were using the arts to do this. I remember the first time reading Gwendolyn Brooks, her poetry. I was just blown away. She has a poem called "The Lovers of the Poor." I
Hmm.
remember reading that, just being like, "Oh my gosh, this is so powerful." Or reading I remember reading the book Borderlands by
Hmm.
Gloria Anzaldúa, who's like really important figure in critical studies, feminist studies, queer studies, Chicana studies. And in this book, she's like flowing from prose into poetry back into prose. She's flowing from English into Spanish into what she kind of calls her version of Spanglish, and it's like the form of the book is doing as much work as the content of the
Mm.
book. And I thought, oh, okay, there's room for that voice. There's room for that creative angle in in writing even about the stuff that I wanted to write about, which
Yeah.
was racism and xenophobia and
Hmm.
sexism and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Did you start your books with kind of a like were you working with an agent or working with a publisher that was kind of guiding the direction, or did you have were you more of a writer who was kind of had an idea and wanted to get it out there into the world, or both?
I Well, definitely the latter.
Hmm.
I mean, I wrote articles before I wrote books,
Hmm.
and and I had been writing poetry for a couple decades before I wrote any articles or
Hmm.
any books. My approach to writing has always been I'm going to write the thing that I'm moved to write, and then I'll figure out if there's a home for it
Mm.
outside of how I can offer it to the world, like a
Yeah.
publisher or something like that. I know that a lot of people working in academia, especially, can't necessarily do that, especially if writing is stressful for them.
Hmm.
But I was like, just fortunate enough to love writing. So
Hmm.
I never had an agent actually, and I never really had mentoring when it came to writing. Nowadays, I meet people who, are writing with their professors or other kinds of mentors,
Hmm.
and I never had that. I just kind of figured it out.
Yeah. Yeah. So right now in your work life, living life, etc., how much of your time are you writing? Are you doing quite a bit where you're thinking about writing or the practice of it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an interesting moment right now because for 5 years between 2003 and 2008, I was teaching at a little university in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's called Hamlin University, just a little liberal arts spot in St. Paul. And while I was there, almost as just like a hobby or to just connect on a different level, because I'd been doing academic writing, my dissertation, a bunch of articles, I started taking classes in the MFA program, Masters of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction. And I left in 2003 to take a different faculty job. And I still had to do one class and a thesis. And I'm doing that thesis right now. So, so it's interesting. The difference between the book I'm writing, what I'm writing for that thesis and what I've written before is that It's the first time since I started writing about justice issues that I'm being driven by the craft of writing, not by the message.
Mm.
So I'm trying to focus on the craft of writing and let the message flow from that rather than starting with the message, then crafting the writing around that message. And so, I'm thinking a lot about that. I'm thinking and mentoring other writers on, especially writers who have been writing academically and are trying to liberate themselves from
Mm.
all the critical speak and the academies and all that. So I'm thinking a lot about opening myself up to kind of a getting back to the roots of who I was as a writer before I, started writing more academically or writing for like practitioner
Mhm.
magazines and that sort of thing. So
Mm.
that's been wonderful, and how to engage audiences in a different way.
Yeah.
And yeah,
It almost feels like, as you're talking about that, like I feel like the road home, right? Like it's back to your childhood home of some kind. The home as in like the child writer, the teen writer, the poet, and this winding road that took you in many different directions. As you kind of work within this juxtaposition of writing in the craft of and then message versus, like you were saying, the message and then kind of editing and thinking craft, is there one that feels like a little more lockstep for you, like one that comes a little bit more naturally and one that takes more work?
the latter takes more work right now. There's a lot of different kind of layers to this in a way, but when you're writing for like academic journals or educational practitioner magazines,
Yeah.
there's a formula, and you have to just kind of learn how to produce something that kind of feels like it's followed the formula, but also has a unique voice to it. I think I became very proficient at that when I needed to be. But what was dying inside me was what before I did that writing was much more natural for me,
Mm.
which is I'm just going to have a seed. I'm going to have one line, and one line that creates sort of the beginnings of an image. And I'm going to start painting out the image from that one thing. And I could start with just a seed, an idea, and then paint out 10, 12, 14 pages from just just that little seed. That's how I started writing. When I was writing poetry, it would just start with a word. Like,
Mhm.
oh, with poetry is just partially, the best poetry you can read without even thinking about what it means and just the sound. It sounds good. Just the stringing
Mm.
the syllables together just sounds good.
Yeah.
In some ways, it was tough sometimes being an academic writer because, in a way, that's still how I write. I will fret every sentence. I will fret over every syllable, not just in terms of making a clear argument, but because I was a creative writer. I want it to sound good. So I will spend this morning. I wrote for like 3 hours. I think I wrote maybe a total of 6 sentences. It's
Mm.
not the most productive way to write, but I'm working on learning how to get back in the groove of that, so it comes out a little easier.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of some conversations I've had with other writers where it's like it almost is like because the academic is so proficient for you, the doctor, right, is is there just willing and ready. It's the thespian, the artist that you have to sort of tap into, And so whether that's a run or standing by a moving body of water for a period of time or, spending some time looking at the sky and then kind of capturing all of that and bringing that to the work. It seems like that has been something that feels pretty universal among my writer friends that I've been able to talk to on this podcast. So
Yes.
you are coaching, and I just want to put this into a place of accessibility for people who are listening. You are coaching. Are you mainly focused on kind of that academic bleeding outside the lines kind of listener here?
Yeah, that's a lot of what the coaching has been so far. People who have been writing academically and are trying to learn how to either incorporate more of a creative voice into their writing, or learning how to write, sort of shaking off the conventions of academic writing, so
Mhm.
the focus can be on clarity and depth, and not you know how many big words are used, and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Often it's people kind of unlearning all they learned
Mm.
about writing. Anytime I've taught writing or coached writing, it's felt like a lot of it has been about people unlearning all of the terrible habits and presumptions they had about writing.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing this recurring theme in all of your work, actually. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So yeah. So and I love it. People who have the courage to say, I don't want to be stuck in these conventions. I want a broader audience. I want my work to be more accessible to people. I want it to be more fulfilling for
Mm.
me. So, I help them with their writing, help them find platforms for their writing that will publish writing like that.
Mhm. Are you working mainly in like cohort models or with individuals, or how would people expect to maybe work with you?
Right now, it's with individuals. I do have plans to do more cohorty sorts of things, like writing groups and writing retreats and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to have something down the road to plan for and dream up. If people were wondering about how to just acquaint themselves, if they don't know about your work, where would you point them first to find something to explore more of what you've shared?
Oh, great question. I mean, if they just search my name online, basically all of my work is online. So they could go to paulgorski.org. That's actually like my personal website, but it has links to the other stuff in
Wonderful.
case you want to see that, and some of my poetry, and a picture of me holding my daughter, and maybe me with a cat. That would be a place to go.
Awesome. Well, Paul, is there anything else you want to say to the people listening? I'm sure we've sparked a few layers of interest among activism, writing, creativity, even the academia. Is there anything else left unsaid so far?
Well, the only thing I could think of is, one thing I wish for everybody is some kind of mode of expression that allows them to share what they have inside with other people,
Yeah.
both because other people benefit from that, but also it could be such a powerful release. Maybe it's writing for you, maybe it's art, maybe it's just taking some chalk and drawing on a sidewalk. Some kind of form of expression I think is so good for the heart, good for the soul, good to model for kids as art programs are getting slashed,
Mhm.
that this is important. So, I wish for everybody to just find something.
Yeah, I love that. Find something. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing everything. I hope that those of you listening find something. And if nothing else, we have this time together that has really sort of opened portals in my own heart as we've been speaking. So I'm so appreciative. Thanks so much.
Betsy, it's been my pleasure.
By Firelight is a Lit Path Studios production and is produced by Jamie Gale and Betsy Delzer. Music is by Legito Music and Pond 5. Thank you for being a part of our beautiful collection of stories.